I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit more about Hale and about his idea of the inevitability of coercion, issues that came up in the seminar. So what I've done is I've prepared this brief presentation, a couple of slides which I'll talk about, that I hope illustrate somewhat better the points that Hale is trying to make, better than the diagrams I drew in lecture or that I was able to draw in the seminar that I ran. And the particular issue I want to consider is this issue that was on the seminar agenda of whether or not one ought to agree that taking control over the work process from factory owners and giving it to a guild or union organization would neither add to nor subtract from the constraint which is exercised with the aid of government. So let me explain this picture and how it's going to help us think about this question. If you look at the upper left, we see here worker A. Was what I wished to do. There we go. Worker A. Worker A is facing a choice. He is the pronoun I'll use. He can work under a boss or he can starve. And the way I've drawn it, the distance of these choices from the red line in the middle indicates how preferable they are. The closer they are to the red line, the more preferable they are. So he'd rather work under the boss than starve. Now, you might immediately ask, is this a case of constraint exercised with the aid of government? Certainly it's a case of constraint. I think we would all agree that work or starve is a coercive proposition, just like your money or your life is a coercive proposition, or makes you feel constrained. But we might not agree that this is a constraint exercised with the aid of government. So, for instance, you might say, even if there was no government at all, he would still have to go out and work in order to not starve. But Hale's point, and you can see this in pages 472 and 473, when he talks about, on page 473, he talks about the law-made dilemma of starvation or obedience. Hale thinks this is a law-made dilemma for two reasons. First of all, the worker can't just go and eat whatever food he finds because that food belongs to someone, it is owned, and if he just takes it, the law will punish him. So that route is foreclosed to him. Alternatively, you might say the worker ought to just go out and start growing crops and deal with his own subsistence. He doesn't face the choice of starving and between starving and working under a boss. He faces the choice of working under a boss or providing for himself. But the thing is that, as Hale points out, and I'll quote here from 473, there is no law to prevent the production of food in the abstract, but in every settled country there is a law which forbids him to cultivate any particular piece of ground unless he happens to be an owner. This, again, is the law of property. So that's why Hale can talk about the law-made dilemma of starvation or obedience, and why he can suggest that this is a form of constraint exercised with the aid of government. So that's the situation of the worker. If we look at the other party to the transaction, the employer, I've drawn her preferences in the same way. So the further the choice is from the red line, the less preferred it is. And she can hire worker A and place him under a boss. That's her most preferred choice. On the other hand, she has a pretty good fallback position if she can't come to terms with worker A, which is she can hire worker B, is not much less preferred. She doesn't want to not hire at all. She's in the market to hire someone. So that's her least preferred option. But she can choose between worker A and worker B. She'd prefer to choose worker A. This, too, to some extent, is, well, to a substantial extent, is a form of law-created coercion in the sense that she's not, for instance, just allowed to go out and hold a gun to the worker's head and say, you have to work for me now, right? So the choices that she has before her are choices that are created by the law. The fact that she's got to actually pay is a fact, for instance, that's created by law. So both of these parties face a constraint which is exercised with the aid of government. The fact that the employer has a good option in hiring worker B means that she has significant bargaining power over worker A. In principle, she can get him to accept a wage that will be just above starvation, right? So just a little bit preferred to starvation, as long as she's always got the option of hiring worker B. Now let's consider the situation in which the law takes control over the work process from the factory owners and gives it to a guild or a union organization and says, in effect, you can hire workers, O employer, but you have to hire them subject to a particular set of rules inside the factory. So certain options are now ruled out. The worker cannot hire out to work under a boss because the law has changed, and neither can the employer do that. So those choices are now off the table. The employer faces a choice between hiring worker A with union control, or hiring worker B with union control, or not hiring at all. And the way I've set things up, not hiring at all is still not attractive, even with union control. You could imagine that that might not be the case, but that's the way I've set it up here. At any rate, the point is now the employer still wants to hire worker A because that's the most preferred option available to her. It's the closest to her ideal point. But she has to do so under union rules, and worker A then gets something closer to his preferred point than he got in the first scenario. So, yes, we see constraint exercised with the aid of government in the sense that the employer has now been constrained to move to a point that is less preferred to her. She's moved like that. Than in the previous situation. And we see, oh gosh, here's government, constraining. On the other hand, Hale's point is that there was government constraint in the first instance as well. This has just changed the character of the government constraint, moved it around so that the employer feels more constrained, is choosing between options that seem further apart, and the worker feels less constrained, is choosing between options that seem closer together. So that's why Hale says that changing control over the work process neither adds to nor abstracts from the constraint. If you look at the situation just from the point of view of the employer, you say, oh gosh, previously the employer could do what she wanted, and now she's not able to do that anymore, so there's more constraint. But when you're talking about market transactions, one party's constraint is always another party's freedom, and vice versa. One party's freedom is always another constraint. And that's why Hale thinks that you cannot increase or decrease the amount of coercion.